Hello, friends. Hello, hello. Hi, LinkedIn. How's it going, everyone? I see you all in the chat. Hi, dev community. Hello, France. Hello to everyone who has joined us previously, and a particular hello to anyone joining us for the first time. If this is your first time, I'm AJ, and this is GitHub Demo Days, where we tend to focus on hands-on demos of specific features and processes. Today, we're going to begin with a new question. What is infrastructure as code? If you know the answer to that, go ahead and put a thumbs up in the chat. If you have no idea what infrastructure as code is, go ahead and type the letter F. All right. Also, if you do find this discussion useful and want to see how it might apply to your team or organization, feel free to use the QR code that I'm going to drop in the corner right now, and you can book a meeting with us. So, to help me with the topic today, I've got Evgeny, Rahman, Solution Architect from Professional Services, and Eric Johnson, Senior Solutions Engineer. Thanks for joining us today, gentlemen. I'm excited to dig in. Please take it away.
Hey, thanks, AJ. Great to be joining everybody here. I'm Eric Johnson. I'm a solutions engineer over on the GitHub team. And I'm here with Evgeny.
Hey, everyone. I'm Evgeny Rahman. I'm a solution architect at GitHub Professional Services. Great to be here today.
All right. And I guess let's kind of get started here. Our aim today really is to kind of to talk about infrastructure as code, and really sort of it's a starting point. We've got a couple of weeks here of sessions here that'll be looking at various topics of infrastructure as code, sort of how to do it, how GitHub handles that, and how we sort of deploy and build GitHub using infrastructure code, how that intersects our own practices, how we see folks doing some automating security and some other kind of components, sort of less traditional components. But what Evgeny and I thought we would start with today really here is to start kind of at the beginning. What is infrastructure as code? Why might you care? And of course, this is demo days, so we're going to go primarily here from example. But AJ, are you going to let me share 3 slides first before we do an example? Right on. Thank you. All right. So infrastructure as code with GitHub and your favorite robot. And there's some flexibility in that. We'll get to that here in just a second. But from the get-go here, what are we talking about? What is infrastructure as code, IaC here for short? Well, let's start. What's infrastructure? Let's just start there. Okay. So infrastructure is everything that you need to run your applications, everything that you need to run your software, typically except for the software itself, the application itself. So it's all kinds of stuff that exists sort of around outside of that, okay? And so maybe we're talking, depending on how and where you provision here, maybe we're literally talking about server provisioning. Okay, this could be actual physical servers, virtual, cloud type stuff with the software that you're gonna need that's not your application, but that gets all of that stuff set up. If you're deploying to the cloud, as so many of us are at this point, that would be cloud resources and storage. Maybe server provisioning is virtual. Maybe there's nothing involved with server at all here, but it's configuration. Clearly, there's quite typically networking components of this thing. So networking configuration as well, cache, other utilities from that standpoint, database configuration as well. And typically when we talk about infrastructure as code, it's getting the gear up. This practice, typically with infrastructure as code, kind of takes you up to the point where whatever you're doing with object relational mappers or data definitely, however you're getting the database structure in place, that's kind of a gray area. Typically, we don't consider that infrastructure as code, strictly speaking, but whatever tool you're using to manage that would take that. But obviously, infrastructure code gets you to the point where you can kick off and run those migrations and get the tables, change schema as needed from that standpoint. Now, so that's infrastructure, right? Obviously we tend to take that for granted. Kind of in the old days, there might have been a dedicated team, and maybe these are your days too, a dedicated team that kind of handles operations, provisioning, and kind of continuity around this. But obviously in the world of cloud, that sort of changes the roles of that team and whether there is a dedicated team or not. If you're doing full-fledged DevOps, maybe that's not at all a dedicated team. The code piece of this thing comes in with how do you get all of this stuff configured? Code here being a vehicle for that. And as you can imagine, infrastructure configuration tends to need to change over time, needs to be consistent, needs to have ideally some approval around that, right? So that you know, kind of when a change gets made, maybe who approved it, but more importantly, what change happened. So you can generalize about that and get much better at repeating what you've got to do to deploy your applications. Well, what we're going to talk really today and focus on today is the GitHub piece of this. So how does it work to be able to handle those sorts of configurations as code, just the way that you would be handling your application code? So configuration, typically done in files, versioned and managed in GitHub, just the way application code might be. Approval workflows, right? Managed, we're talking in GitHub here, so managed with a pull request and all of the sort of attendant workflows that are that might be working through there. And of course, with all of that, if you, as we're going to do today, just for demonstration purposes, we're going to be using GitHub Actions to do that. As you might know, there are great ways to build in automated tests as part of that deployment, just as you would managing your application code itself. And of course, you have the option there around all of this, not only around sort of automating workflows and so forth, but the ability to sort of put policy and approvals to codify those, put those in place. And because we're talking GitHub, and pull request is our vehicle, we're going to see sort of trace of all of that sort of stuff here as we go along. Okay. Lots of ins and outs. We'll talk about a couple of that because there's many different approaches to this, but that's enough talking for the moment. Evgeny, what do we got? Can we do demo time here?
Yeah, definitely. All right. So let's see. Here's the repo we are going to start with. At GitHub, a lot of things, I would say most things start with the repo or source code repository. This might be a familiar sight to some of you, the file layout with the README and everything. This is meant to be a very basic starting point. We are doing a demo using a Node.js application today. And we're going to be showing you how we can take the application, which the source code's here. We are going to use infrastructure as code, in this case, Azure Resource Manager templates or ARM templates. And those are these files here. And we're going to dive into all of this. So, we'll look at the structure, what these files mean, why we have multiple files, and so on. And so we are going to deploy the application using the infrastructure as code templates and the power of GitHub Actions. And GitHub Actions are our automation workflows. And with GitHub Actions, you can do a lot of different things. It's not just CI/CD. You can do project automation. You can really do anything you can think of that's compute that you can encode into a file like this. You can integrate a whole bunch of stuff, right? So we're going to talk about how the building blocks inside GitHub Actions all work together to give us this development experience where we can automate our infrastructure provisioning. And we are going to see how the changes that we run through here as actions workflows are going to end up in Azure, and how we see environments come in and deployments happen. And we are going to look at how our end product, this website, is going to change based on those workflows running the infrastructure as code and automated deployments functionalities. So hopefully that got everyone interested. How does that sound, Eric?
That sounds awesome. I'm leaning in here. Hey, can you blow up the font on your screen a little bit?
Of course. Perfect.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. All right. Yes. Okay. So back to that repository we're looking at. So that first folder of GitHub workflows, that's where actions live, right? Because I've seen that before. When we deploy stuff, we've seen that. All right.
Yes. That's so the
that's going to be
GitHub,
our engine. Okay.
Yes, that's where everything lives. That sort of metadata and meta functionality for the repo. So in this case, the workflows that power the automation that happens in the repo happen through here. And each of these files will represent a separate workflow, and we'll see how those get triggered. They're triggered off of different events and off of different paths, and they serve different purposes. And we'll look at the structure of actions as we go through and do the various deployment pieces and explain why they are the way they are.
Cool. All right. And looking here at those other folders, so application, I'm guessing that's my app, right? That's in our case, this is a Node app. That's going to be, sort of typical functionality. Oh yeah, okay. Web config, app.js, config YAML. Okay, I'm familiar with all that stuff. Package lock. So all that stuff's kind of versioned in there. The app itself, awesome. Can you take us back up one?
Yep.
All right. Tell me about infrastructure.
All right, so infrastructure is just our infrastructure as code. And the as code part is very important here, right? We are not going to be doing anything that is not powered by what you see here. And in this case, infrastructure as code is represented with JSON files, right? So we have the actual template that shows the definitions for the infrastructure that we'll be deploying. And it uses schemas that are predefined for Azure, and you can check out the schemas here. There's some other stuff going on that's templatized, like for example, the web app name will be sourcing the parameters from the other file, which we'll look at in a second. And we have other pieces like on cloud. You always want to specify your location. There is a Azure concept called a hosting plan, which is what controls the resourcing in your resource group. And we'll go over these concepts a little bit. We're not going to get too in-depth on this particular demo, but these are essentially all the cloud infrastructure details that you need to provide when you're performing a infrastructure provisioning and deployment to something like Azure. And we have all the resources in one place, defined in one place as code, which again is important because that means when we change it, we can use the same change processes that we would for code because it is code. And then here we have this other file, so the parameters file. And this is when I was saying the other files parameterized. These are the parameters that fit in there. So for example, we have the name that we prefer to give to our hosting plan, our location. So this is, I guess, the file that you could think of as the values for the variables. If the other file is essentially a declaration of what variables we want, this is how we provide those variables to the other file, or how we instantiate based on a template. And then there's also metadata, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It's essentially something that explains what this ARM template setup represents, and it has some information about the type of subscription we're using. So we're going with essentially the beginner Azure for Student type subscription, which anybody here should be able to use. It's the beginner level. The OS we are using is Linux. We're deploying a Node.js application, so that's perfectly a great fit. And I'd like to give a huge shout out to Usha. So the example here that we see is actually built on work that was done by Usha N. And you can go here to this repo and check out the source material for a lot of this. There's a lot of great stuff here. Node Express app being the template that this is built on. And it shows how to deploy a Node Express app to Azure. But if you go out to the org, this is actually an org from Microsoft on GitHub, and it has a lot of great examples of things that you can do on Azure. A lot of plug and play kind of functionality, a lot of interesting workflows and examples of templates and things like that. So a shout out to the team that's been building this, and especially Usha. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Usha. Okay. All right. So let me kind of make sure I got all that. That's a lot. So what I'm hearing in terms of what we're going to be showing today here is a couple pieces. So our application itself, we're not going to focus on that today. It's an application, great. It's Node. That's a key piece. We're not going to worry about that too much today. But the two pieces here are mostly the infrastructure folder itself. So configuration. For demo purposes, we're going to go deploy to Azure. So we're using Azure's own like ARM templates for that. Okay.
Yes.
More on choice. There are other choices there. More on that in a sec. And then also then for our purposes today, what's going to kind of kick this off, the engine behind the two engines, I guess, right? So the infrastructure folder's got ARM templates, which handle the configuration. Our workflows are going to use GitHub Actions to actually make the infrastructure updates, deployments, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that what we're doing? All right.
It's three great things working together, right? Like our source code hosting and the pull request flow, the power of the GitHub flow, which lets us review changes, make them with checks and balances in place, get the team collaborating. Then we are going to power that particular process with actions, because actions can be event-driven, right? So the actions are going to do the automation kickoff for us. They are going to run through what we've defined in our workflows folder, and that is also going to plug in to Azure, thanks to the Azure actions that are provided by the Azure team. And so, essentially, we have all these building blocks put together, and we show how we can implement a typical modern software development flow for provisioning both infrastructure and for provisioning the apps that get deployed onto it, and also show something that we call review apps, and how that is possible today using GitHub Actions in Azure.
All right. I can't wait. You're going to make me talk a little bit more before we get there, though, aren't you?
Definitely.
Man. All right. Hey, Jay, can we switch back to me? It's a couple more slides. All right. Why? And kind of what do we get from all of this here? We'll see it in just a sec, right? But really, what do we see from this? It's consistency. Right. The idea here is, if we've got a sort of a series of patterns, a series of configurations, we can reuse them. Okay. And in essence, reusing them means that we can be sure, in particular, very important kind of reuse, we can start deploying those in a test environment, temporary environment, staging environment. Again, how many layers do you need to go through your typical QA processes? If you're more automated, you may need fewer environments. If you're less automated, you may have a standard set of environments here that you work through. What infrastructure as code enables you to do is to be very sure that what you deploy in one environment is the same thing that gets deployed in further environments down the road, and that you have a very specific record through GitHub pull requests, as we'll see, of what changed where and there. And what Evgeny is going to show us in a second here is, as we deploy these, we're going to be using GitHub's built-in deployments, so that, again, in that one, looking at, in our case, code for that application also can give us a picture of what's deployed where and what's the history of those deployments. Again, the big thing, and a lot of details here, again, after failures, mean time to remediation tends to go down. There's all sorts of benefits from infrastructure as code generally, which is why enterprises are very, very excited about this. All of these really are follow-ons, though, from the sense of that that your deployment, not just the application piece of this, but everything else around it here, is completely repeatable, with changes recorded, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Again, the idea here is that what you've got here, the configurations are reproducible. They're not going to change, again, in one place or another here. And the configurations tend, depending on the mechanism you choose here, to be self-correcting as well. So there's not this idea of like, oh yeah, well, we've had that thing deployed and we know what it was when we started and the application first got out there, but after that, things have gotten a little scary or vague or whatever. Again, depending on sort of the engine that you choose, the vehicle here that you choose for infrastructure as code, configurations can in fact be self-correcting. Okay. Shout out here just around compliance. We are not going to dive into this today, but again, the fact that you're reusing components here, that you see exactly who did what, means auditing is far easier for those folks. It also opens up the capability here for compliance as code. And in a session that we're going to have at this time, next week or the week after, I forget, we got a couple of more here in this series. One more is going to dive specifically into compliance as code. We're going to have some folks here, some guests who work particularly with the United States federal government around standards for figuring out how to do this. There's a whole variety of standards here that can be stuck to. We can go ahead and version these similarly, treat this as code that speeds deployments, improves compliance, makes the security folks much happier with what's going on. And then at the end of the day, let's folks deploy their applications much faster. Chat question, are we going to make a public fork of the demo days repo available so we can view? Evgeny.
Yes,
right.
we'll definitely work on this. We want to make sure that when we give you the repo, when we open source it, it has everything you need in it. It has everything commented. It has how-tos. It has guides. And so, that'll take just a little bit of writing time, right? Like everybody loves writing documentation, and it's always super easy. And so we'll do that and release it, and we'll make sure to let the audience here know when it's available out there for you.
So yes, not immediately though. Okay. Again, what do you need? How to get started? This repository will be a start for doing infrastructure as code kind of this way, but we should really talk just a little bit more bigger, right? Right now, our example, we're going to show GitHub Actions, we're going to show Azure's ARM templates, but that is by no means the only way to do this, okay? Those will be our specifics here of what we're going to demo, but there are many other ways to do this as well. The core pieces here, if we take a look at this diagram, and we're kind of going down, we're flowing up from upper left down to lower right here in this diagram, right? So we're working. Evgeny's working on his laptop. I'm working on my laptop. We're looking at stuff from this standpoint, and we go ahead and commit code here, gets pushed up to GitHub, as you'll see here in a pull request. Feature branch, pull request, standard GitHub flow that you are likely very familiar with, okay? Depending on what that impacts, and our actions triggers are going to, in our case, going to look at this. Infrastructure is changed. Okay, a tool then looks at that, says, oh, we've got some kind of change that's happened here in GitHub version. Let's go out and deploy those changes to the infrastructure. Okay. Now, in our world, GitHub Actions are what's sort of detecting changes that particular file, and those actions then go ahead and push the ARM templates out to infrastructure to update that, to make that change. That's what's going to happen here in our demo, and that works fine. That doesn't work so fine if you're not using Azure, though, right? So if you are deploying to the cloud to AWS, that's not really going to be an option. The ARM itself it's a great technology, but that is very Azure specific. There are a whole bunch of sort of other options here around this. Okay, we call them sort of a templating engine here. I don't know that that's the official name, but basically it's that glue that sits in the middle between code changing in GitHub and that code being deployed. Again, ARM templates here are what we're looking at for this today, powered by GitHub Actions in this case. AWS's CloudFormation, set of CloudFormation configurations here that can serve as that engine in the middle, okay? In a situation that is, if you're going to on-premises infrastructure, or you were talking to multiple clouds, you might use the last item on this list here, Terraform. Okay, which again is designed to work to do exactly that engine here that operates in the middle, listening to changes they get, enforcing those configurations, and making all of that consistent. Again, Terraform really geared primarily here to cloud infrastructure. Couple of tools that predate these other three a little bit are designed, can work sort of all over the place, but we're really designed not even to be pre-cloud. They're Ansible or Chef. So the idea here are tools, again, written in different languages, but the idea that these tools here are looking at on-server configuration and making sure that does not drift itself. Again, these tools are looking out to get, hey, something changed in the repository, we need to go ahead and change configuration and deploy. Okay. The ins and the outs of using any of these tools, they are different languages and so forth. So again, they operate differently. But the benefits here that we're talking about, the benefits of being able to have your infrastructure configuration, server or cloud configuration here work through Git workflow and automated testing approvals and all that sort of thing, code reviews there, again, will work with any of these tools. But again, for us, GitHub Actions here are what's going to kick stuff off for us, the glue between GitHub and the deployment. And for today, ARM templates. We'll be looking at different versions of that here over the next couple of weeks. All right, Evgeny, can we see how it really works?
All right. Okay, so we are going to take a look at what's already there first, right? Because everything that I've shown you so far is actually built exactly the way I've described it, right? So we had actions that ran already, provisioned our production version of the infrastructure, right? And then we also had the actions run to deploy the Node.js application, right? So let's look a little bit in depth on those building blocks, moving pieces that we talked about, and how they do what they do. And with that understanding, we are then going to try one live. Always the best part of any demo is just seeing what happens live, seeing the gears in motion. But it's always helpful to have the context of what those gears might be doing. So let's dive in. So first, we are going to look again at the application just to show you where the pieces that are kind of going to be most visible to us live. So this is a web application on Node.js. If you're not familiar with Node.js, it's a JavaScript-based framework or library. Different people have different opinions, but essentially, it's a set of code that will help you to write reactive web applications that can listen to input through like this mini server kind of paradigm. So this is kind of the app. App has a lot of these pieces, such as listening to the ports, listening for incoming HTTP requests, and then routing that around to other pieces of the application. And you can load up your dependencies in here. And this views is what we're going to look at next. The views and the view engine, which is adorably named Pug, is what's going to power the changes we're going to show today. So here are the views in the views directory, right? And you see that they all have this extension of .pug. So this is what's known as a view template. Most major application frameworks for the web have some form of templating engine that they work with. Node.js has Pug, it has Jade, it has Dust, I believe. But the way that it looks is this, right? So this translates into HTML structure. So if you're familiar with HTML, you can have nested elements such as divs and paragraphs. And the format here, just to understand what we'll be doing, is at a certain level of nesting, we get to the success text element, which has a paragraph in it called GitHub plus Azure Rock. And just to show you live where that is, it's this right here, right? So the change we'll be introducing will be to update this area. And we'll go through a process where we review and approve those changes. So that's just the very basics. We're making a change to our application, right? Like, imagine, when we make a change to github.com to add new functionality or new messaging, right? We would go through a flow somewhat similar to this, where a change is proposed through a pull request, and then a lot of automation magic happens to validate that and make sure that everything is working right before it is released to the developer community around the world in production. So jumping back out of application, because this really will be the major part of the application that we'll be touching. Other than that, it's a fairly standard application, and you can kind of even tell that by looking at the breakdown of languages here. We have our Pug templates, we have a lot of JavaScript, which is what Node is written in, or what you write Node applications in more accurately. And this CSS, you can kind of see it in action here, right? Like this is why the site looks that way, because we have some styling in there, and stylus, which is also for styling, as the name might say. So enough about the application, right? Like, let's look at how it gets out there. So jumping back into infrastructure, I'm going to show you where these pieces fit into the Azure control panel or portal there in a second, but just let's look at the major elements. So there's the schema declaration that we talked about. This is version 1. And the schema really drives each of these things being valid, right? Like, so essentially what goes in here is not arbitrary. It has to follow a certain structure, right? Like, JSON is fairly free form as a file format, but this particular JSON file follows this schema. So it's a deployment template, right? Like, and this is how a lot of other stuff works. You can use similar things with Terraform and CloudFormation, right? Like, there's these kind of schema-based JSON files, and the schema has to be valid, and the inputs in it have to be valid in order for it to be evaluated correctly by the engine that drives the infrastructure as code. In our case, it's the ARM engine, right? So the Azure Resource Manager engine. And so going back through this, we have a place to plug in the subscription ID, and here's where the schema really comes in, right? Like it's a string. We have a web app name, which is the name that we'll see in our portal. We have location, which is, where the physical data centers are that will host this application. So this is an important cloud concept, right? Like if your customers are more on the East Coast, you would have a East location or East US location for your deployment. Or if you have customers around the world, you would try to have multiple deployments with different physical data centers or data center locations that you deploy to make sure everybody has a shorter round trip time with the request to be serviced by your service or application. Hosting plan name, say again, this is kind of what the resources are being powered by. So sort of like what they're tied to from a resource management and also billing management at the end of the day perspective inside of Azure. That's also, so server farm resource group, so server farm, if you're not familiar with that concept, that's a grouping of servers within a data center, right? Like, so it's sort of what it sounds like. It's a bunch of servers all in one place, right? And so this, again, is something that's sort of a concept that bridges data center and cloud, because guess what? Clouds are actually data centers behind the scenes, right? It's just somebody else's computer. And then a few of these are fairly regular, like, whether we want the application to always be on, what kind of SKU this offering falls under. So these are more almost like accounting type pieces that we have to provide in order to provision the infrastructure, right? Like, because, this plugs into the actual Azure cloud and into a subscription. In this case, this is my test subscription. And we'll also talk about subscription ID in that frame as well. So then we have a little more substitution going on here. And, I'm just showing you these kind of nitty-gritty details to explain that there's a lot that happens in a template that needs to be set up correctly, that is going to be dynamic, that you need to sort of like plug in variables into, right? So I think one of the important things in infrastructure as code is there's definitely a development element to building out the right templates. It often helps to start with blueprints and templates from the cloud providers or from folks like myself and Eric, where we kind of do some of the experimentation, we work with you, and we give you something that we think is going to work well for you, and get kind of the details in the right order, and then we move over to the parameters, and this is really where you say, hey, this is going to be the name of my app, this is going to be the name of my resource group, I want this kind of instance, I want this kind of operating system, I want this many workers, meaning how many processes I want to serve the requests at the same time, right? Like that's where you plug in the variables to determine the size and shape of things, right? Like, and you follow the template, which really provides the general idea of what the layout will look like. In this case, we're not doing anything too grand. It's a web application, so we're running it on fairly small infrastructure footprint, right? So we have one worker in there. We're running it on Node 14. So that's the version of Node.js that we are aiming for on our Linux platform. And that's really pretty much it in terms of the parameters that we'll be working with. All right. So we are targeting Azure App Service as our environment where we'll be deploying, and we're going to look at that next. So that's kind of the text on the screen version of this, right? Let's see how that looks over in the Azure portal. So this is the resource group in Azure for this demo days application. And the resource group is really a umbrella term or encompassing concept for everything that will be deployed and provisioned for this particular application. And it's just how we kind of organize things together in terms of cloud resources, right? So if you think about your home setup, right? Like maybe your laptop, your desktop, your monitors, everything's in one room, right? It's the office, right? So it's the resource group is the office. So this is really the collection of resources and one pointer to them or one way to refer to them all in one place. And then you can see the subscription ID in there. And you can see some of the resources under there. So for example, the Node application So this is our production node application, and it shows you the URL where it's deployed, and then it shows you what service plan it's on. All these details that you need to manage and provision and keep your infrastructure running and operating smoothly. You get some metrics live there. So as requests come in, you can see how this changes, how your response time to customers is going. Like when somebody requests the application, is it responding within the SLAs that you set for your customer, right? Like, are there any alarms that need to go off, anything you need to troubleshoot, and so on. So that's sort of the level at which we'll keep this. I mean, essentially, this is a deployment of our application. There are multiple deployments we can do, and that's one thing that we'll see live in a few minutes here. And essentially, we can deploy multiple versions of this app because, like we were talking about, our deployments and our infrastructure are templatized, right? So essentially, whenever we plug in a new variable into here and run through the provisioning process again, we get a new copy. And the only difference between the copies is the difference that is in here, right? So for example, when we modify these files on a pull request on a branch, and now we have two different versions of the configuration as code templates or the variables that we parameterize into there, the machine behind the scenes, right, which in our case, the mechanism is actions. Actions can kick into action, and it can provision based on those templates. And as long as they're valid, as long as they're evaluated correctly, and they make sense to Azure, right? Like Azure sees the request come in based on the provisioning from the templates and says, okay, that's valid. I know how to handle this. I know what you're asking me for. I know how to provision this. You're going to get a new set of infrastructure. And that's what you see here, right? So we have one provisioned for the main node app. We have a review. We have another review app. We have another review app. And we can keep doing this, right? Like cloud resources are elastic and scalable, right? So essentially, if I had multiple changes that I was pushing through my project pipeline at the same time, I could scale out and have these all reviewed separately. I could constrain it where I can only have one deployment of a review at a time, right? Like that's all stuff that I can control through my pipeline built out in GitHub Actions in this case. And all of these things are running. So I was talking about the server farm, right? Like if you want to see, like that's kind of the stuff that was visualized for the server farm here. And so all of them are referencing the same server farm, but I have multiple parallel app deployments, and each of these can be slightly different or majorly different depending on what I'm trying to do. I don't have to keep redeploying to prod to see changes. I can validate changes before it ever gets to prod because each of these looks slightly different, right? And so I'll show you what I mean by that. So how's that so far? Any questions from the crowd?
Well, I've got a question. Yeah, see, AJ, if we got anything out in chat, that'd be awesome. I've got a question for you, Evgeny. So, one of the things that I always felt as a little bit of a pain point, maybe this is a personal pain point, maybe you all have felt this as well. But, first time through using whatever cloud console, there's a lot of questions to answer, right? To fire up, even with something like a app service here, where a lot of that work is done by the cloud. There's still a lot of questions to fill out, right? The form, there's a number of choices, subscription ID, all these other pieces. What I love, and looking at some of these templates here, I'm recognizing these keys. Oh, I answered that question, or I answered that question manually, whatever. And so does this mean, Evgeny, that using a technique like this, one, I don't have to answer those questions again?
Correct.
And secondly, that when I need 3 or 7 or 25 copies of this, in essence, in this case, ARM is going to be answering all those questions, and it will be answering those questions consistently.
Exactly. That's the beauty of having templates, right? Like, so we get it right once, and then we just leverage the power of that continuously, right? Like, and here's the big thing, right? Like, speed is an important part of today's software development process, right? And speed is built on trust. Right. And so if a team can trust each other and they can trust their processes, they can trust their infrastructure, they can go faster without worrying about things breaking or changing from under them. And they can focus on the things that bring the most value to their customers. Right. So, for example, if this was a web app, like an e-commerce store, and they want to give you new functionality in terms of shopping carts or how the products are displayed, right? They don't necessarily want to worry about how the infrastructure is getting deployed under the covers, right? They get it right once. We have an e-commerce web app, it gets deployed. We know how that happens. We can validate it before it goes to production. Our designers can go in and log in and take a look and say, that's what we wanted. It's all like clicking through like we expected. Let's just work on those pieces. Let's not worry about provisioning infrastructure or sort of clicking buttons to deploy things and waiting for things to show up and things like that. So, you know, the trust is built on speed, and speed is enabled by automation, right? Which is a great segue, I think, to looking at our automation engine, which in this case is GitHub Actions. And GitHub Actions consists of workflows. And we're going to go through a couple of these just to show you how they're different and how they're the same. If you've never seen GitHub Actions before, so in a repo like this, GitHub Actions live in this .github workflows path, right? So there's a .github folder, and inside that there's a workflow folder. And in here, each of the workflows is represented by a different YAML file. So let's open up the provision infrastructure one as an example, and I'll show you what it looks like on the inside. So we have the name, which is what will show up in the Actions tab for this workflow. And then we have events. So this on keyword, it says, here are the events that I support. This is what will trigger me to run. So one is called workflow dispatch, and I kept that in there purely for kind of demo purposes, testing purposes. This is just the manual trigger, and I'll show you the button in a second as well. And then push, and this is the important one, right? So essentially, anytime new code is pushed to this branch, which is main, which is our default branch, which is our production branch, and on the path infrastructure. And this is kind of what we've been looking at all along, right? Like there's a directory in here called infrastructure, which has all our templates. And so what this altogether says is anytime changes are pushed to infrastructure files on the default branch, I need to run, right? And what that means is it'll trigger a reprovisioning of infrastructure based on changes made to the files in here. And this is production, right? It's a pretty big deal. So the way that we make changes to this will be pull request based, right? So, you know, because we want to make sure to validate those changes before they ever make their way to where they could affect production. And, you know, we also might want to schedule things. We might not want to be continuously updating production infrastructure, right? So that's why this piece is just about infrastructure provisioning. It's not about the application deployments, because we might be doing, you know, 10s or 20 or, you know, like maybe 100 application deployments a day, but we're less likely to be changing our infrastructure at that rate. Like usually infrastructure takes a little bit longer to either, you know, go out of date where we need to update it, or just like, you know, we change how we want to deploy it, right? Like it's a longer cycle. It's a different modality, right? So that's why this is decoupled from the application deployment. And so when we look through this, we see some familiar names again. So Azure login, and you see that this is using the Azure login function. So this is actually something you can go and take a look at if you look at the GitHub Marketplace. So on the Marketplace, there's an actions category, right? And everything on here is available for you to look at and try out. And here, if we type in Azure and take a look, you'll see that there's a lot of stuff provided by the Azure team, right? We can click on Azure as the publisher and take a look at all the variety of things that they provide. So one of the things is Azure CLI or Azure login, right? So Azure login, this is what it looks like. You go to the marketplace, the URL will look like this. You'll see what the action is about. You'll see examples of how to set it up. And actually, they've done a great job with showing a lot of different scenarios of how you could set things up for use with your workflows, right? And so everything that you see that I'm using is a action that's available to you, right? So for example, login, first we log in, we do this with our credentials. And so I'll quickly show you what that looks like over here in the settings tab. So in the settings tab of my repo, I have the secrets category. And so you'll see I have these repository secrets, which means they are secret variables, secret data that is available only to stuff within this repository. So if you think of actions, actions that run in the scope of this repository can reference these using the secrets syntax, which we'll see in a second. And I can update this, but I cannot view these. That makes it more secure, right? Like, so essentially, once I get these from the Azure command line, I put them in here. And so the Azure credentials, in this case, they look sort of like a JSON entry. I'm not going to be showing you that because, it's secret. But there's instructions out there on the Azure documentation website on how you generate these. And then you also have your Azure subscription ID, which again is a series of letters and numbers. It's like a GUID-looking string that I also update in here. And so both these things have to be valid and have the right permissions, kind of like with any sort of credentials, API keys, and things like that. And so going back over to my workflow, that's what we have here. So we have a bunch of environment variables and secrets, right, in terms of our variables that we plug into these workflows. And the way that that works is, for example, for login, right, I provide this credential variable based on secrets.azure credentials. And you'll see that's the variable name from the secrets menu that we're looking at, right? And so what happens is this action, the code here, it knows to look for this input called creds and uses that to log me in the context of this session here on the GitHub provided cloud-hosted runner. And so everything that happens after this happens with me logged into my Azure account, right? So then I check out the code onto the runner, and it now has all the source code, so both the application and the infrastructure on there. And then I have this resource group check or create. And this is where we get into some infrastructure as code patterns, right? Like, so we want to have an Azure resource group, right? And we define that name here, right? So demo days node app RG. In our case, we already have it, right? So we don't want to actually create it again. We don't want to go through the sort of the downtime or the rotation time that it takes to bring down the resource group and create it again. So that's why here we've done a little bit of like conditional coding and say, if the AZ group exists, and this is where we're using Azure CLI, by the way, which is another marketplace action, and we can specify the version, and then we can specify our commands, right, like that in a block here. And so we say, if AZ group exists and it has the name of our preferred Azure resource group, then just say, it's already there, don't create it. If it's not, then create it using this create command and make sure it's in East US, because that's our preferred location. And this is something, again, that I could have plugged in here through either secrets or through environment variables, right? Like this is a variable, a parameter to the command. And then it'll say, after it's done, that the resource group is created. And this, again, all depends on me having the right credentials and permissions to actually go and do this in the account. And then one last step, using the CLI again in this case, is you can do a deployment. And then the deployment is done with this group as the parameter. So the group that we either just created already had, the Azure resource group, which is where we deploy all of our stuff to, as you can see. And then we also say, this is the web app name that we want. And here's that parameterized magic that we were talking about, where if this name was different, right? So this name could be Demo Days Node App. It could be Node App Review 1. It really could be anything, A, B, C, D, F, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Like, as long as it's a valid name combination of characters, we can plug it in here and it'll deploy it with that web app name. It'll be a separate web app deployment using all the same bits and pieces that we defined in our infrastructure. And so it'll create a spot for it in the cloud, a place in the cloud. This, by the way, you'll see it is not touching anything related to application code. It keeps referencing this infrastructure directory that we have in our infrastructure JSON files, but it is not actually going through and doing anything with the application directory, right? So that was sort of an extensive tour through this, but I just wanted to show you, it's all in the code again. We have infrastructure as code. We also have automation as code, right? Like, this isn't something that I went into a portal and had to click through in order to generate. This is all code that can be changed. It can go through the same pull request process, right? So we're going to take a look at two more. We're going to go a little faster just because, we already covered the major pieces. So we're just going to see how these are different. So this one is the companion to the infrastructure one. See how it says I'm ignoring infrastructure. So any changes anywhere other than infrastructure, that's my responsibility, right? Like that's what it's saying. And so it's going through, it's building the Node.js app. It's assuming that you made a change to the app, so it needs to rebuild it, reinstalling the dependencies. And then it's packaging all that up and creating this deployment artifact for us. And then at the end of it all, we are again doing our login into Azure, because this is a completely separate session and completely separate run from our infrastructure provisioning, right? This could be happening at a different frequency, different time. And so we're logging into Azure, and then we're deploying using this web apps deploy action from Azure. And so we are again giving it that web app name, right? Like we provision our infrastructure. So for example, we want to deploy to demo days node app from our production environment. So that's what the variable would be here. And then we give the web app package path, which is application. So everything in /application is our deployment code, right? So that's where we want to grab the application from. So you see the web app name is demo days node app, the package path is application, and our runtime Node.js version is 14. Like anything within 14 is good for us. So we say 14.x. And then one more, and this one is the one that combines both these things, right? So far we are talking about, we want to separate it out. We want to separate out doing our infrastructure provisioning. We want to separate out our code deployment, right? But what if we want to actually do those things at the same time, in the same iteration? Why would we want to do that? Well, we talked about that concept of review apps, right? So we talked about the fact that, hey, infrastructure change, code change, right? Like in order to continue to keep the trust on the team, we want to make sure that that's reviewable. Infrastructure changes need to be reviewed. Code changes need to be reviewed, right? How do we enable that? How do we see that the infrastructure changes and the code changes work together before we introduce them into our production environment where our customers are using the product, right? So that's where we can orchestrate the moving pieces that we've seen before, our building blocks, into one. And so here we just go through building. So we build the app, we package the app, and then we provision and deploy a review app. And here you'll see we're getting into environments, which we'll see in a second live. So you see we have an environment called review, and that's a GitHub concept. So GitHub has this concept of you can specify what environment you're targeting with your deployments, with your jobs. So we call the environment review, and the URL is actually going to be dynamic. So the URL is going to be based partly on our web app name, so demo days node app, and then we're going to have this review to indicate in the URL that it's a review version, and then we're going to use the pull request number. So it's going to always be different, and that's kind of what you were seeing in here, right? Like we have different pull requests, and they have different review numbers, right? And by convention, we know that AzureWebsites.net is the hosting URL for the Azure App Service websites. And so we keep going down. It's a lot of familiar stuff. We're packaging up the application. We're packaging up the infrastructure templates. And then we are logging into Azure once again, because this, again, is a whole different workflow, right? Like we don't have our login from the previous ones. Then we, again, go into the CLI. We create a resource group if we need to. But by this point, it should already exist since this is a pull request. And then we're going in and running our deployment. And this is, again, where the names of things matter, right? Like we are plugging in parameter names. So we have this app name that we constructed using this syntax dynamically. So we're passing that in instead of like a pre-configured name. And then we're providing our Azure subscription ID out of secrets. We're providing our Azure resource group. And then we're deploying it. And we're deploying it with that dynamically created app name. And we are saying, /application. Everything from /application is in our package, and that's what the application is represented by. So that's everything that we're doing. And so how does that look live? Well, we talked about actions and actions running, right? So this is where our actions run. You'll see that there's 3 different workflows. So we talked about provision infrastructure using ARM templates. We talked about provision and deploy review app. We talked about deploy app to production, right? So let's give it a spin. We are going to work our way through creating a request like this, a pull request, which looks like this visually. And I will show you where I'm going in. I'm going to do this entirely from the web UI just because you can. GitHub has a very nice web editor. If you haven't looked at it before, I suggest you check it out. And the power here is behind this pencil icon. And we are an edit view for that index.pug that I was talking about inside the application. So we are an applications views index.pug. And so here we have this message with, GitHub plus Azure Rock, right? So we do not contradict that fact, but we want to add something. And we want to say, hello, demo days. And there we go. And so here, when I'm committing this, right, so I can say, adding hello message. And then instead of committing to main, which, in a production version of this, we would have it logged down that, most people can't commit to main directly. We would have the main branch protected. But since it's a demo, it's turned on for Eric and myself. Sorry. So here I'm just going to say adding hello as my branch name. And I'm going to click the propose change button, which is going to take me over to creating the pull request based on that branch. So you see the branches there, adding hello, adding a hello message, Studio, and that's Eric. And that's this way Eric gets a notification that that's what I'm doing. I can add some labels, right? So enhancement is a good one. So, and this helps just like in terms of metadata to explain why I am creating this change. Right, so now we see that my pull request is in place, and it says this branch has not been deployed. Right, so the repo is aware that there's a few environments that I'm using, and it knows that those environments can be deployed to from actions. Just because in my actions you saw I had the keyword specified for environment, and I provided some URLs, and now you see that the first step in my provision and deploy review app workflow has started. And this is the one that is keyed off by pull requests, right? So just to revisit, while this runs, let's just revisit that real quick now that we're seeing it in action. So if you go in here, this is the workflow that's being triggered. And the reason it's being triggered is, there's a pull request key in here, and it says any pull request that is targeting the main branch. So basically anybody who's trying to propose changes to production through the main branch, this is where I want you to kick in and go to action, right? So that's what is happening. We can see this in multiple ways. We can see this over here. It's running, and you see that Eric's come in. He got the ping. He came in and said, looking good. He approved it. And so the approval's there, right? So now we're just waiting on the workflow to complete. And you see that we can look at details through here. So we can click on that and we go over to the checks view within pull requests, right? Because the actions are actually configured as checks. And this gives us this line by line view of what is happening inside of the action. I clicked on, so I guess maybe I did that a little bit too quick, but here I clicked on this here, and that brings me into the actions for that workflow running. And so as it's running, you see that I already completed this, and right, you get your, so we talk about pipelines. Everybody who's talked about CI/CD has heard pipelines in some form or shape, right? So this is a visualization of pipelines, right? So we see that the build node app step of the pipeline has completed. If this failed, if suppose there was something wrong with my node code, which never happens, who makes coding mistakes, right? But if for some reason
speak for yourself.
Exactly, right? So, we can all live in our dreams, right? So then suppose there was something wrong with this, we'd get a red X here. I'd have to go back to the drawing board, see what was wrong with the change I proposed, right? So, and then since that passed, we are now going through provision and deploy, and it is deploying to previews, giving us this nice little progress bar showing that, it's, where it is in the process. And if you're more into seeing text output rather than visual output, I guess, like, the nice blocks that we have, you can go in here and it'll actually show you output for each step, right? So it'll show you what it's doing to set up the runner container. It's going to show you how it's checking out the source code and so on and so forth, and we'll get through the actual uploading of the ARM templates, and then we are going to go through the actual provisioning of the code as well. So this is just the building part, right? Like this is where we're compiling and sort of putting together artifacts, right? And then this next step that's running, and you'll see that it takes a little longer because we're actually interacting live with the cloud here. is we're downloading those artifacts that we built in the previous step. We're logging into Azure. Like I've said that a few times now, right? So this is where it's happening in action. And then we're going through, we are setting up, see, this is going to be our dynamic URL. That's where it's being configured and constructed and put into the environment for this run. And then again, we're using the CLI to go through and see if we have a resource group. Resource group exists, like we were talking about, so we're good there. We do our CLI script here to run through the provisioning of the infrastructure. You see there's a lot of JSON, and this is the JSON that we were configuring, right? Like, so in our infrastructure folder, we were constructing this JSON that now gets sent over to Azure, and Azure recognizes it and uses that to run the commands to construct our infrastructure. And then the last but not least step is we are deploying our web app. And you see that it's all completed, right? So we completed the job. And so we see that the location is given to us of where it is. I'm not going to click it here because I want to show you something else, right? So, and I know we are at the top of the hour here. So let's get to the cool part, right? So here, you come back here, the link is right there for you. You click that link, you go over there. Hello, demo days. There's our change. Check out the URL, review 4. This is our review app. We go over to a production version. It's still stable. It's still intact. We haven't made any changes. We go over here. We take a look, and you'll see that the new environment has been provisioned, review 4. This is where we can see the URL as well. It gets populated in here as well. We click on it, same place, right? So then if it looks good to us, everything is great, right? Like, what can we do with that? Well, we approved based on what we saw in here. And just to show you one more thing, these environments that we're talking about, right? So we have our production environment. It shows you that it was deployed to 14 hours ago. This shows you that another environment was deployed to inside, in review, we also deployed, right? We just deployed. This is the traceability Eric was talking about. And so I can go and view the deployment through here, right? So it looks good. No matter how many times I look at it, it looks great. So what can I do? I can go in here and I can say, all right, let's merge this thing. So then when I merge and I'm good, I just delete the branch, high confidence, high trust, high speed, like we were talking about using automation and infrastructure provisioning. And guess what's happening? This golden dot that represents that another workflow has been kicked off. And if we go in here, we see that merging has triggered deploying the app to production, right? And so the workflow we were talking about before, again, it's building the Node app. It should just revalidate what we already validated, that the code will work, right? So it's going to run through that for the production version. If you need to pull in production dependencies, that's where it happens. And then as the last step, it's going to deploy the web app to production in Azure. And then we'll see our change live over on Azure. And so this is pretty much it. We can definitely hang around. I know we're just a little bit over maybe our initial time. We can hang around while this workflow completes. There might be questions in the chat. Maybe we can talk through that while this happens. But this is it, folks.
Hey, that is quite cool and quite problem solving. It addresses many, many pain points, certainly that I've felt in my career and for many of our customers as well. Hey, we got a couple questions in the chat. One of them, though, I think we could show. Can you take us to just look at the deployments? We can do that for main or for pre-production, either one.
Yeah.
I know
absolutely.
Brett had asked here, how can I tell that the infrastructure itself committed to head is what's in use with the latest deployed instance of the app? And there's a couple of different ways to sort of do this, but I think one way that Evgeny really had, we just look at, if you just take us up to the top and let's look at the deployments there.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. So when we go over here, right, there's a few things we can look at. So like I said, there's environments, right? So environments can show you when production changed last, right? So we can see where the change came from, like which branch and everything. And we can look at the deployment. We can look at the activity log in general, right? Like what happened in production, what happened in review. And so we can trace back any infrastructure changes that way, right? And the other part to it, of course, is we also have the actions themselves, right? So we know that in our system, the only thing that can provision infrastructure to production is this workflow. So we can look at all the workflow runs. We can see that last it completed 14 hours ago, right? So we can click on that. We can click on that, see how it ran. We can see what commit triggered this run, right? Like we have this link here. We can see the change that was made, right? In this case, it was essentially a no-op, just something to trigger it, just adding Node.js, right? But this will give you the full, I mean, that's the beauty of GitHub, right? Like you have your source in one place, you have the automation in the same place. You can cross-link between them. You can reference things using URLs and these nice visual cues around sort of what changed from what, who changed it, very important, when they changed it. In this case, even the commit was verified, meaning the signature on the commit is a valid signature to my certificates on my machines and all that kind of stuff. So this will give you the traceability, right? And there's so many approaches you can take to getting to the same point. You can also go into infrastructure. You can see the commit history of this whole directory inside main and in other branches, right? And this again shows you, and you can go back to that point, browse back to it, and look at that same view. So there's definitely a few different ways you can do this. And the other part to it is if you protect your main branch, right? Like if you don't allow commits directly to it, then the other thing you can get is this pull request history, where you can see what happened through pull requests, like when it happened, who approved it, what were the review comments, right? And that's how you also build up the trust. That's how you also solve your problems in one place using code, using automation. Is you suddenly plug into the powerful GitHub flow where you can collaborate, you can assign reviewers, you can have conversations on top of the code changes. You can add checks of any sort, like suppose linting the JSON or linting your JavaScript code. And it all gets sort of put, that's the hub part of GitHub, right? Like it's all in one place. We work together in one place. We work where others can see it. There's no surprises. There's no secrets unless their credentials, right? And that's kind of how I work, and that's why I think we love it.
And Brett, follow up there from Brett. Yeah, so convention is part of it in the sense of, yes, this workflow does that deployment. But I guess what I would emphasize actually is if you take a look at that deployment, that environment log history, what we're seeing here in the view that we see are branch names because those branches still exist. But those branch names, if you don't have it, for some reason you're not using GitHub Flow or somebody pushes something there, you're going to see commit ID. So in terms of in one spot, as long as you're using the environment API, which we strongly recommend here, folks come into the application itself, looking at that right column environments, let's see what's going on. Sure, a convention that production is production, review is review, or whatever you choose. Again, that you have that flexibility to name those as you see fit. But looking through that list, you are seeing the history of every deployment there. And the advantage of using this sort of the architectural model here that we are with infrastructure as code with a new environment here per deployment is we've got history of all of those deployments. There are other ways to do it where you can see just the most recent and so forth. But again, the way that Evgeny has put this together, we've got the advantage of having all that history. But in this case, where I look down at that activity log, so adding hello here, those are our branch names here. Those actually link to a specific commit ID, so we can see exactly what's happening there.
Yes, exactly. We can navigate around between these things because these are all GitHub concepts, right? Like, so GitHub models. So for example, this one is the pull request, right? When we go into pull request is 1 to n number of commits, right? So we can navigate those commits, see where they were introduced into another branch. We can also check out the repository and look at that locally on the command line. There's different ways we can reconstruct the graph there. But if we want to stick to the UI, we have this deployments view, we have the pull request view, we have the actions workflow view. They all in unison say the same thing. They're different views into the data, right? And then last piece here for the folks who stuck around or those watching it later on, here's the production version. And you see it's updated because we merged to production and it's deployed on our production infrastructure. So hello, demo days.
Let's do one more quick one here. I can take this one to get it very quickly. So Darshana just asked, we were talking about secrets. in about sort of access there? Are there more ways to access secrets other than from the command line? And the answer to that is, so secrets are accessed a couple of ways. They can be set in the GitHub UI in the web browser, as we've seen. They can be set by API. We expose those to an API. They can be set, but those are write only. They can't be read that way. So they seem super secret. Keep in mind, their job is to be able to be exposed to actions runners. So yes, we try and make them sort of hard to come by. We make them easy to change and rotate as needed. But keep in mind, to work, the secret, to be able to be used on a runner agent, the secret has to be able to be passed into that runner agent. We do a lot of work on in terms of the runner and the command line and log scrubbing so that we don't display those. But the secret's there. If you really want to be a Sherlock Holmes style actor here and get a copy of the secret, they get passed on to a runner. The runner can log those, echo those, do various things with them. So again, that is nature of, that's sort of the nature of engineering. If that is a concern for your deployment world, I would highly recommend that you take a look into the GitHub environments API. It's not connected to infrastructure as code. You can use them that way, but you don't have to. But the idea there where we allow you in GitHub to specify multiple environments and allow you to specify manual approvals for those environments and identify sort of a trusted team or individuals to be able to do that. In that world where, okay, you're deploying, you're deploying a particular branch, you get pretty good at, we have a way to have parallel secrets here, so you've got a secret tied just to production. That does quite a good job for isolating those sorts of passwords. Again, you don't typically need to worry about that necessarily for test style infrastructure, again, depending on your world, but particularly for production infrastructure, that can make an awful lot of sense. And then, we had an awesome general question, which Evgeny, I think that's going to be, we're going to have to have a whole other session on that one about what about security?
Oh yeah.
Yes,
yeah, absolutely.
What about security? So much to talk about sort of in that area. I think for us, for today, Evgeny, unless you've got kind of a short way to address it, there are many, many, many facets of that. Again, if you're working with GitHub for your application flow, protected branches, approvals, code owners, if you need to sort of slice and dice who can approve what, all of those are mechanisms that can help you make sure that you're getting the approvals you need at the code level by the teams you need to approve them. That's only one aspect of it. Obviously, there's logging, reviewing, a whole variety of stuff here. But I think for today, we'll leave it at that. That is something we would love to talk about in fuller context another time.
Absolutely.
Did we forget anything, Evgeny?
I think we covered everything. We showed the moving pieces. We showed the engines that power everything. We showed how we can set up just one pattern that we can apply here, right? Hopefully, folks are interested. We are going to have a few more sessions to follow up here in June on Infrastructure as Code. You can see more Hubbers present on how GitHub does Infrastructure as Code and some interesting partnership collaboration sessions. So definitely tune in next time. And if this sounds interesting, that's going to be interesting to you as well. Thank you, everyone.
And if you need to talk to the GitHub team about any of this for work, use that QR card. Our enterprise sales team will be happy to give you a chat. Who knows? Might even be me. See you guys. Thanks for joining us. Have a great morning, afternoon, wherever you are, time zone wise. We'll see you next time. you.